convene. I have to convene the Wolf Institute sessions, right? One second.
Cary. There you go. Right? I might hold this up as a demonstration at some point.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I see the numbers increasing as people come into the room. Before we begin the webinar, I'm going to go ahead and promote people from attendees to panelists. So if you receive that request, please accept it so that you can join the webinar with your camera and your microphone on during the Q&A portion of the session. If by some reason I miss your name, please raise your virtual hand and I'll go back and promote you.
Somebody's got some background noise going on. I don't know who that is. It's one of us.
It is me.
Okay.
So we're going to start in a couple of minutes. So welcome everybody, and please turn on your cameras if possible. So create a bit of a virtual community setting. And as we get ready for the lecture, please note, I have a dog here. Please note that this is an academic seminar series. This is not necessarily a popular public lecture. So those of you who are not students or scholars, please bear with us and understand that this is an academic seminar. And the purpose of the seminar series is creating a conceptual framework to examine issues of contemporary anti-Semitism. So we've invited scholars to deal with these conceptual scholarly issues, and these are not necessarily kind of for public consumption, but everybody is very, very welcome to attend. And we believe at ISGAP there are no bad questions. All sincere questions are very welcome, and comments as well. So welcome. Okay, so we're going to start soon. Please turn on your cameras. And
once again, if you're not able to turn your camera right now, that means that you have not accepted my invitation to be a panelist. So I'm going to go ahead and promote everybody again. Please accept my invitation. If I somehow miss your name, just raise your virtual hand. That button should be at the bottom bar and at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to do so and participate in the Q&A portion of the session.
cool. So it's a distinct honor and a privilege to introduce you to Cary Nelson. Cary, we're very fortunate, is very active with us at ISGAP, and he's on the academic steering committee and our advisory committee. So it's really a privilege to be able to work with Cary. And as many of you know, Cary is a leading scholar and expert on issues of contemporary anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel. Cary received his doctorate from the University of Rochester, and he's a professor. He taught modern poetry and literary theory at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he's now the Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences and a Professor of English Emeritus. He's also an affiliated professor at the University of Haifa. His work has included decades-long project of building up the holdings in modern poetry and the Spanish Civil War in the library's Ray Book and Special Collections Department. Cary has a long, illustrious career of articles and books, and he's also been active in fighting for justice and human rights over the decades. And he's also been a member of the Executive Council and helped to ensure he served as the National Council of the American Association for Universities Professors and served as the association's second vice president from 2000 to 2006 and its national president from 2006 to 2012. And he's authored, as you know, many books and articles. He has an illustrious career, and I think unlike many scholars who care about anti-Semitism and kind of remain silent for all sorts of maybe personal or political or career reasons, Cary has always been, I guess, brave and has the integrity to stand up for what he believes in. And this is what we try to emulate at ISGAP. So Cary, the floor is yours, and thank you for all you've done, and thank you for being here for the seminar series.
Oh, thank you very much, Charles, and to everyone who's on board for this morning. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to share some of these ideas with you. Let me begin with an anecdote. A few years ago, a quite well-known donor to Zionist causes approached me with a request to join him in a national campaign to fire tenured faculty who advocated for explicitly anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. I refused, explaining that I believed in and had defended not just tenure itself, but also specific academic anti-Semitic faculty who had that job security, Ward Churchill among them. The donor was, to say the least, very frustrated with me and approached me again a few months later, making it clear that he would personally fund this national project. This time I added that if I betrayed my principles, I'd be of no use to anyone. He was, one may say, still more frustrated in response. However, lacking an appropriate faculty leader, the project never materialized, which is why I don't name him. It was not the only time that my recent AAUP presidency had led to my being pressured to take positions contrary to my principles. Breaking the Silence, the Israeli group, for example, repeatedly and rather intensively lobbied me to support boycotting Ariel University, since it's located on the occupied West Bank and is a potential impediment to a two-state solution. The first occasion was during a private tour of Hebron that Breaking the Silence conducted for me and a friend. Again, I refused, believing that opposition to academic boycotts either had to be absolute or it would fail as a guiding principle. Unfortunately, increasing anti-Semitism, both on and off campus across the world, makes it inadequate to rely on these principled stands alone in responding to faculty anti-Semitism. The work I have done criticizing both the BDS movement and anti-Semitic faculty publications no longer seems to suffice. So I have been led to ask what more can and should be done about faculty anti-Semitism. I should begin by saying that you can pose a basic question. Does academic freedom protect anti-Semitism? And the answer, for better or worse, is a qualified yes. In many cases, academic freedom does protect expressions of anti-Semitism from sanctions. But those protections are not absolute. I'm going to draw from what I trust is my forthcoming book from Academic Studies Press, an ISGAP book that tackles some of the strategies I believe we need to adopt in response to the changing realities. The main challenge I want to emphasize today is that the problem of faculty anti-Semitism has been complicated immensely by the extraordinary escalating impact of social media over the last decade and more. What is to be done about the faculty role in anti-Semitism on social media? As late as 2017, amidst national networks deluged with calls for genocide, Mark Zuckerberg predicted that Facebook would end terrorism fight climate change, lift people out of poverty, and prevent pandemics. Hard to believe that he said that, but there it is. Facebook would create happier and freer souls. Social media would engineer a new, more enlightened society. We can expect to see comparably unrealistic projections of our desires onto the metaverse. Zuckerberg knew better, and others soon had the truth displayed indelibly. The 2017 Rohingya genocide in Myanmar was enabled on Facebook. In Sri Lanka, Facebook drove the violent 2018 anti-Muslim riots. It drove them every step of the way. Facebook hate pages operated as openly as newspapers, encouraging mobs carrying out mass murder. Both countries saw social media overwhelmed with a rising chant for blood, explicit and in unison. A 2018 UN report confirmed Facebook's role in promoting and organizing group violence, indeed in fomenting genocide. Switching to Europe, in Germany, 64% of people in extremist groups had been led there at Facebook's suggestion. Launched in 2006, Twitter by 2015 was suffused with revenge fantasies and conspiracy theories, establishing a culture of provocation. In 2021, President Biden would bluntly declare that Facebook was killing people. Zuckerberg nonetheless maintained the utopian stance because it discouraged government regulation and distracted public attention from the social media reality. Social media is now responsible for enabling the community's collective id. To do so, group online hate provokes the psychological state of de-individuation that we have long recognized in mob violence. Hate speech is the glue that binds such communities together, and anti-Semitism is one of its primary forms. Zealous, morally outraged faculty anti-Zionism is helping to encourage it. The wider social effects of social media are becoming clear, and they're weighted toward disaster. Imagined to be a force favoring democracy, it has rapidly evolved to be the reverse. As a consequence, it's both delusional and irresponsible, as the American Association of University Professors does, to view social media simply as a neutral space for expressing personal opinions, a kind of public square where an absolutist version of academic freedom should prevail for faculty participation. Until 2015, there was a rough AAUP consensus that only extramural speech outside a faculty member's areas of teaching and research was fully protected by academic freedom. But in 2015, the AAUP decided that all faculty speech in the public domain should be protected from professional consequences. I and one other member of the AAUP's Committee A objected, but we lost the debate. In 2021, a faculty member argued in the Chronicle of Higher Education that a faculty member who raved in favor of white supremacy could declare his ravings off limit for professional evaluation. Virulent anti-Semitism could also be off limits if it were online. In 2023, this year, I learned of a search committee for a faculty position that was instructed it could not consider social media participation in evaluating job candidates. In other words, if you found out that a job candidate was a virulent anti-Semitism on Twitter, you had to ignore it. You couldn't let that be a factor in your decision. I believe we need instead to apply professional standards to online faculty speech that reflect the reality of how the medium functions in society. How many additional lives were lost to coronavirus skepticism after the Stanford University's affiliated Hoover Institution's Scott Atlas discouraged the wearing of masks and tweeted his November 2020 plea for Michigan residents to, quote, rise up in opposition to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's COVID-19 policies. That brings me to one of the most remarkable examples of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic faculty social media activism. I refer to George Washington University's Laura Sheeha, who many of you know from the letter distributed earlier this month. I could quote scores and scores of her tweets, but let 6 stand in for the rest. 1, Zionism is literally predicated on settler colonialism and the notion that a whole people is inferior and therefore worthy of extinction. My bad that I don't think that's progressive. 2, oh yes, the big bad rocks. My God, how scary, next to the self-identified best military in the world. I'm shaking in my boots for them. 3, Zionists are so far up their own asses, they don't see how this actually proves the point of undue and criminal force by occupying forces. 4, living in a world where white supremacy and Zionism, no matter how soft, continually collide is to live in a world of incessant gaslighting and one where you're in protective overdrive. This isn't in my fucking head, it's real. 5, and fuckers are still arguing about whether or not Zionism is a form of racist white supremacy. Okay. 6, Zionism means settler colonialism, period. It is anti-Semitic to assert, as Laura Sheeha does, that Jews have no authentic relationship to the land and no right to a homeland there. She considers Zionism's relation to the land a form of psychosis. Even before her fall 22 required graduate course in the George Washington University's professional psychology program began, some students had a hint of what might be in store for them. They'd watched several of the Lara and Stephen Sheeha YouTube videos that summarized their shared goals as professionals and their dedication to unqualified condemnation of the Jewish state. The Sheehas had co-authored a 2021 book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, and had given a number of recorded interviews upon its publication. The book presents case histories to show Israel's destructive impact on Palestinian psychology, mounts a fierce critique of the Jewish state, and urges that psychoanalytic practice worldwide devote itself to political liberation. As Sheeha points out in their Against Alienation interview, part of her message is that, quote, you cannot be objective as a clinician. You should join the motherfucking struggle, end quote. When Sheeha's work began to be controversial, she first briefly toggled her Twitter account to private and then closed it down completely in January 2023. But an NGO had gathered her tweets just before then, creating a file of 9,776 of her tweets that was shared with me in confidence. So she may have closed her account, but her tweets will live forever. Why it took her years, more than a decade, to realize that hundreds of tweets laced with profanity would not do her any good professionally, I really cannot say. As students inform me, they access some of Sheeha's Instagram messages and her numerous tweets. Her tagline was Black Flag Hag before even beginning the course. Uneasiness about the course began to spread. There were innumerable tweets like, "Fuck Zionism, Zionists and settler colonialism," using Palestinian lives as examples of their boundless cruelty and power. Anybody who can't get it yet, who peddles both sides bullshit and doesn't denounce this persistent violence, is complicit. These were first-year graduate students. In addition to the orientation events they attended, they inevitably socialized with one another. They couldn't easily shrug off the conclusion that being complicit might have consequences for them in the professional psychology program in which they were enrolled. Although we don't know whether the hateful character of the tweets led them to be taken up and distributed by algorithms, we do know that tweets expressing extreme hostility or moral outrage are a high priority for selection by Twitter's algorithms and wide dissemination to anyone showing interest in the topics addressed. There's a good chance Shiha's tweets had a much wider distribution than even she may have imagined. So, what consequences does the Academy face when faculty members contribute to social media's system-wide reality distortion, its identity-affirming falsehoods, its subcultures of toxicity and hate, its doom loop of polarization and misinformation that culminates in calls for violence? Ferenc Kruzar and his co-authors notably found that in 6 out of 7 countries studied, the mainstream political right enjoys higher algorithmic amplification than the mainstream political left. The existing algorithms on social media platforms favor emotionally charged expressions of moral outrage, something of which Shiha is adept. Every single such word in a post, every emotionally charged word in a post increases that post's algorithmic distribution by 20%. 5 such words, 100%. The contributing prejudices, like anti-Semitism, are typically already present in a society, but the algorithms persuade more people that they are valid, and they create new affinity groups by drawing together people with different conspiracy beliefs, mashing hostile tribes together into larger hate groups. The online moral outrage against Israel that many faculty members expressed during a series of wars with Hamas thus helped give license to numerous bizarre anti-Semitic fantasies. Rational critique of Israeli policies and practices didn't have the same power, as the algorithms would not prioritize its dissemination. The algorithms reward inflammatory rhetoric, not rational analysis. This algorithmic alternative universe has made the claim that fierce anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism can be kept separate from one another obsolete. When evil intent is vehemently ascribed to the Jewish state, it implicates Jews worldwide. So Israelis are accused of committing genocide in Gaza, and soon they're imagined to be responsible for the COVID pandemic. When Congress passed a stimulus package in 2020, for example, the most shared posts on Twitter reported that the bill falsely siphoned $500 million meant for low-income Americans to Israel's government. From there, the cry that Jews will not replace us, that they aim to erase our culture, requires no conceptual leap. The news about a Jewish plot to dilute the white race spread in company with hyperbolic anti-Zionism. The claim that Zika was a Jewish plot was already in circulation. The QAnon movement would lump together traitorous Democrats and Jewish financiers among the enemies to be eliminated. Reddit's hate communities included, quote, watch niggers die, and, quote, gas the kikes. The Southern Poverty Law Center called Reddit a worse black hole of violent racism than Stormfront, the notorious neo-Nazi site. All this, I believe, justifies giving greater weight to social media activism in a faculty member's areas of teaching or research in personnel decisions, particularly when faculty members like Shiha become super posters, super spreaders who pull the platforms toward those defining tendencies of dogmatism, narcissism, aggrandizement, and cruelty. Super posters, then, are not more thoughtful or principle critical for understanding faculty activity, but they do drive engagement. Faculty are not necessarily guided by rational calculation if they're attempted to achieve super poster status. Anti-Zionists, propelled by moral outrage, may feel psychological warrant to discount any personal impulse towards social media's version of celebrity, instead rationalizing it as a supremely righteous political intervention. There's growing recognition, at least among journalists, that social media has become a corrosive force across the world. Academics who specialize in media studies and those NGOs that work to combat the spread of hate speech and disinformation have reached the same conclusion. A rear guard in the academy has decided it is consequently time to double down on the faculty right to say whatever they please online. Consequences be damned. Contrary to that misguided impulse, it's essential that both faculty members and administrators are free not only to condemn faculty dissemination of both hate speech and disinformation, but also to impose consequences in some contexts. Willful disregard for the responsibilities accompanying academic freedom will eventually prove unsustainable. Now, although algorithms can be tweaked to reduce their destructive potential, companies are well aware that that may decrease time spent online and thus reduce ad revenue. In the end, only fundamental repurposing and restructuring of social media will reform it. So long as the current business model, which militates against content moderation, is in force, hate speech will prevail on social media. I side with former Facebook employee Frances Haugen. Turn off the algorithms. There's no other solution. They cannot be reformed. As the Center for Countering Digital Hate points out at the outset of its STAR framework brief urging a global standard for regulating social media, a handful of companies owned by a small coterie of big tech billionaires dominate internet content, and the communities on these online platforms, their behaviors and beliefs, and the values that emerge from these spaces increasingly touch every aspect of offline society. Hiding behind the techno-utopian halo of online technical innovation, they have both hidden the banal atavism of their core business models and avoided real scrutiny of the harms they're causing. For years, their CEOs, including Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, simply lied before the US Congress, promising a level of content management they never actually delivered, while in reality, proliferating hate drove online engagement and thus attracted paid advertisers eager to reach more consumers. Harmful content, hate and disinformation is high engagement content. Anti-Semitism and other forms of hate generate profits. In fact, companies may be unaware that their ads are placed on misinformation and hate sites. The news media regularly excuse congressional gullibility by referencing the media ignorance of Congress's aging leadership. But that easy excuse hid the much stronger American preference for not sanctioning the unregulated greed of late capitalism's new breed of robber barons. For that reason, along with absolutist American investments in the First Amendment, there's more reason to look to the European Union for practical ways to regulate social media. The EU's Digital Services Act got parliamentary approval in October 2022, sets some standards for disclosure of algorithms, elimination of disinformation, combating harmful content, and regulating advertising on large platforms. They argue that we cannot continue on the current trajectory where bad actors opportunistically weaponize and poison the information ecosystem. For the Academy, we need to deal with the fact that some of those bad actors, witting and unwitting alike, are faculty members. CCDH argues that for social media companies and their platforms, self-regulation actually means no regulation. Academia has, of course, long insisted it can and must regulate itself. How much longer we have to prove that principle applies to academic participation in the Wild West of the internet, I cannot say, but I do believe the future of academic freedom may depend on our acting. In my book, I argue that there are several points in faculty careers where active anti-Semitism can justify serious consequences. First of all, you do not have to hire an anti-Semitic faculty member. If the anti-Semitism is primarily built into their tweets, you still don't have to hire them. A faculty hiring committee is not only seeking a teacher and researcher, it's also seeking a colleague and a community member. Anti-Semitism can and should be disqualifying. Second, and more controversially, a tenure review can consider whether a faculty member's teaching or research is substantially anti-Semitic. I believe persistent anti-Semitic social media activity can also be a deciding factor in voting against a positive tenure decision. Third, a promotion to full professor review can also take anti-Semitic teaching, research, or public speech into account. These are multiple points short of being fired when anti-Semitic activity can justify negative consequences for a tenured faculty member, from annual salary decisions to sabbatical applications. The point is to establish that faculty anti-Semitism has professional consequences. At the same time, none of these personnel decisions should take place without long-term campus commitments to educating about anti-Semitism. Argue in detail that adoption of the IRA working definition can make a major contribution toward that education. So sanctions plus education. The attacks on IRA have warned against consequences that have actually not materialized. Nonetheless, I've taken these attacks seriously, and so I've crafted a policy statement that institutions could use to govern how IRA itself can be used. Those who use attacks on IRA as stalking horses for anti-Semitism will not be persuaded, but those rational actors who are open to discussion may find this convincing. So I'm going to close by reading that statement, and it's in the introduction to the book. This is a statement that I think any campus could adopt when it adopts the IRA working definition. So here it is. The university formally adopts the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism as its official guide to identifying, analyzing, and combating examples of anti-Semitic speech and action. In doing so, we endorse the definition's important qualification that full understanding of potentially anti-Semitic statements requires an account of the context in which they were made. That will often require knowledge of the long history of what has been called the longest hatred, its strategies, metaphors, consequences, and contemporary manifestation. We also join with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in specifying that the definition is a non-legally binding document. Thus, it will not be used on campus as a quasi-legal invitation to disciplinary proceedings against students, staff, or faculty. But we believe its 11 examples provide an extremely helpful guide to the major forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, and thus offer substantial assistance in understanding their increasing presence both here and abroad. The goal of the working definition is not to shut down conversations, but rather to illuminate them with understanding. The definition cannot be used to prevent anti-Semitic speech from occurring, but it can be used to help reach consensus about which statements merit condemnation. That will help alert us to broader patterns of anti-Semitic speech that require a coordinated response. Now, I have no illusion that will convince all of our opponents, but I think it actually blocks the misuses of IRA, not misuses that have actually happened, but misuses that our opponents keep warning are about to happen. Okay, so that's it, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Okay, thank you, Cary. Thank you very much for your presentation and the good work you're doing and the case study that you're examining, which is very important. So what I would like to do, I guess in a way, is sort of present a bit of a challenge to you. So as we create, if we take a step back from your case study, an important case study, as a group of scholars trying to create a conceptual framework to examine anti-Semitism, how does your work fit into this framework? Because I in a sense, I can see, you know, we're looking at soft power and the funding of the Muslim Brotherhood of American universities. That universities are taking money from nefarious sources that are promoting anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel. Then in the United States in particular, but in the West in general, you have the notion of freedom of speech, which is an issue, as you pointed out in your presentation, with social media and social media corporations that are running the social media culture. So how do you deal with the power and processes which are obviously influencing this case study that you present? How do you grapple with the larger issues of analyzing the problem of anti-Semitism in academia?
Well, I think you begin with analysis, and I do think that the IRA definition offers a first step in being able to sort of categorize and classify anti-Semitic statements. I do think that the IRA definition operates in very broad categories. It was designed to be able to be applicable not just now, but in the future. It was designed to have some staying power, to be adaptable. So in the book, I actually offer a whole list of more differentiated examples of different kinds of anti-Semitic speech. And I think those further examples can be used not only to look at internal student, faculty, staff anti-Semitic speech, but also external anti-Semitic speech. I think that, you know, the university as a social and administrative structure has a degree of relative autonomy. That means that we can set rules and guidelines for evaluating and policing, to some degree, university activity that aren't going to apply to the outside world. We don't have the same power over outside speech, but we can ask ourselves whether the contributions that faculty members in particular make to public speech, make to speech in the public sphere, merit professional consequences. What I like to say about free speech is that academic freedom grants faculty members the right to say whatever they want. I mean, if Lara Shiha wants to sort of promote her swill in interviews and distribute it on the internet, it's not just the First Amendment that gives her the right to do that. It's also academic freedom that gives her the right to do that. But within the relative autonomous structure of the university, she's not protected or should not be protected from professional consequences. We can't apply those professional consequences to any domain other than the university itself, but we have the authority to be self-regulating. And in that dynamic relationship with the outside world, I think we can function. And maybe we can offer a model for other industries and NGOs and other kinds of relatively autonomous organizations to exercise some restraint and impose some consequences on their own staff members. So I think there is some hope for, if the university shows self-responsibility, it could be emulated in other domains, especially with other structures that have a degree of relative autonomy, to use an Althuserian term.
You may. Okay, thank you, Cary. So I want to open up the conversation. Would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment to Cary? Please raise your virtual hand. Or
Charles,
Shelley.
maybe I'll jump in and then others.
Shelley, if you don't mind, and then William. Shelley,
Sorry.
but Shelley, are you? No, thought you wanted to. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
Hey, Cary, really thank you for that talk. It's very interesting the way you situate the problems of anti-Semitism within the general question of free speech and the internet. And your initiatives for the universities are admirable, but aren't you kind of telling a David and Goliath story here? I mean, first of all, why just anti-Semitism in the university? There's hate speech. I mean, I'm just arguing, the ACLU version of the argument. It's not just Jews. There's hate speech all over the university. How does what you say apply to other groups? And how in this world, which you've described, which is so saturated by social media, how do we get university presidents to care? Why should they care? I mean, I realize you made a very eloquent case for why they should care, but I just feel that the whole cultural fabric in America is just saturated by Jew hatred.
Well, it's anti-Semitism isn't the only form of hate speech that ought to have professional consequences. I like to use, because I once debated her on stage some years ago, I like to use the example of the University of Pennsylvania's law professor, Amy Wax, who said astonishingly racist things about her Black students. She said that, at UPenn Law School, Black students are always inferior to white students. People ought to wake up and realize it. They're just not as good as the white students. She taught a required course. The Black students, the first-year law students, had to sit in her bloody course after she made comments like that repeatedly. Now she's added Asian students. She says, we're allowing too many Asian immigrants into the country. We need fewer Asians. That's sort of the Trump argument, right? Well, we need more people from Finland in the United States. So the University of Pennsylvania finally decided, she's tenured, They didn't go after her tenure, but they said she could not teach required courses. That she wasn't anti-Semitic, she was racist against Black students, and so they sanctioned her because of her public statements. And I think that was fully appropriate, and I don't think Lara Shia should be able to teach a required course either. I mean, she says Zionism is a form of mental illness. What are Zionist students supposed to do sitting in her course? Believe that they're going to be treated fairly by someone who actually believes that? I mean, hardly. So I think there are other forms of hate speech that should be regulated in the same way. And actually, I say so in the book. I just couldn't, develop all of that today. But I think there are multiple forms of hate speech that should have professional consequences when faculty members engage in them. Now, as I said at the outset, I argued against firing Ward Churchill, although, I wasn't a happy camper reading his books. But I said, he's got tenure, we'll protect his tenure, but we'll also, in some ways, constrain him. He'll have to face consequences. And there could be many consequences, and those consequences might discourage people from engaging in their hate speech. They don't get a salary raise when they're engaged in hate speech. Then the following year, they don't get a salary raise. And the following year, they don't get a salary raise. I actually, when I first came to the University of Illinois in 1970, there was, I think it was a physics professor who was engaged in all kinds of extraordinary hate speech. So they didn't give him a salary raise. He kept doing it. He didn't get a salary raise for the next 25 years. He kept his tenure, but in the end, as a tenured faculty member, he was only earning as much as a graduate teaching assistant. He paid a price, a real price for his conduct. Now that's an unusual case, no salary raise for 25 years, but it shows you that, and in most cases, many faculty members would reform their conduct if they were earning a tiny salary that long.
Okay, thank you. Somebody's microphone is on, and then Shelley, please unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Wow, what a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for all that information about algorithms and so on. My head is really spinning. But my question is focused more so.
I'll tell you, it didn't come naturally. There had to be a little bit of work in acquiring confidence in that word and a few others.
No, I have to go back to the recorded lecture and start documenting all this, the numbers and so on that you cited, because it's fabulous. But my question really comes down to one of the aspects that you talked about with regard to hiring and the procedures for hiring. Now, I know that many university faculty are not unionized. My university is highly unionized to the point where, saying anything you really believe may have consequences as well. So both good and bad, that is, in our perspective, if I can use the word our. My concern, though, is when we participate on search committees. And as we well know, the kinds of conversations that go on, the kind of debates that go on within search committees can become very difficult, very egregious, and very fine-tuned. The difference in labeling someone an anti-Semite versus having participated actively, say, on BDS, et cetera, are quite different when it comes down to a search committee. And targeting someone for having had involvement in those more covert types of operations becomes extremely complicated. And I can't quite imagine how this would go down within certainly my university environment, a unionized one, for example. I mean, I'm just putting it out there because I think it's far more the utopia vision that you present with a search committee, yes, makes a lot of sense. But when it really comes down to selecting a candidate, I think that presents all kinds of complications.
Yeah, well, that's a very good challenge. The first thing to say is that nothing in the way search committees operate requires you to disclose why you're voting in a given way. I mean, there's no external demand that a search committee typically report on its rationales, nor is there necessarily pressure for full disclosure within the meeting process, the discussion process for a search committee. It helps if the search committee, and this obviously does not always happen, spends a tremendous amount of time working together and really bonds as a group so that you feel you trust one another and that you can be honest with one another. But a lot of search committees just don't put that much time in. I've chaired a lot of search committees, and one of the things we would do is we would read everything the finalists had written. So you get down to a few finalists, we read and discuss if it's a beginning position, their dissertation. If it's further along the line, we read and discuss all their publications. We spend a huge amount of time working together until we reach true consensus. And even in that context, one could see the discussion can be about the aggressive social media presence that someone has. It wouldn't necessarily be declaring that someone is an anti-Semite. Some reticence might be appropriate in the language that you use and the claims that you make. And, in a unionized environment, and I helped organize unions for 25 years, so I had an investment in there, although my own faculty never made it, but I was around the country doing it. A certain amount of reticence might be appropriate, but you never have to fully disclose. I mean, that's the name of the game. And indeed, if you feel you're going to have external pressure to disclose afterwards, although you shouldn't, that's one reason to be a bit reticent in the process.
Mm-hmm.
But you can ask, do you want a community member who creates this much dissension? Do you want a colleague who is this vituperative or combative? And I think you are, in most hiring situations, hiring someone you have to work with. And their personality and their style of interacting is part of the story, just as you try to judge what kind of teacher they're going to make, which is a very subjective judgment. I mean, you use all kinds of evidence to try to judge what kind of presence they'd have in the classroom. So those kind of subjective issues are, I think, already given as part of the search process. Just 1 second. I think that's Fred exiting the door. I'll be right back.
Okay,
Be right back.
okay, thanks, Cary.
I was going to ask Cary to teach me how to run a search committee. Right, Shelley? I haven't had those consensuses in the search committees that I've run.
No, I don't know. Maybe he brings pastries.
That is a good idea.
Yeah. But I just to add what in the interim here, the IHRA statement, etc. As we know, Jewish studies scholars, many of whom I admire enormously, have signed against.
Sorry, they required a signature.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that the IHRA statement has been, has been spearheaded on a petition by many Jewish studies scholars who support, or who are obviously against anti-Semitism, but who have declared that this is not a statement that they want to support. And these are Jewish studies scholars who, in many instances, I admire enormously, so, I'm at a loss.
I'll just, before we continue, I'm very grateful for the Jewish studies professors in Toronto who are opposed to the IRA definition, because two major philanthropists took me to meet them, thinking that ISGAP can work with them. And they were just shocked and blown away at their view of anti-Semitism in Israel. And they decided to fund ISGAP. So I'm grateful to them in many
Oh,
ways.
great.
I'm being
Thank you.
sarcastic.
I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the IRA definition actually implies for campus practices. And there's a huge amount of misrepresentation. I mean, as I hinted at one phrase in my presentation, there's a certain amount of attacking IRA out of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right? That's where the critiques of IRA come from, an interested position, not from an objective judgment about its character. And what I tried to do in that statement, which would have been, a little hard to follow with just my reading it out loud, was actually to mark every point of serious objection to IRA and make it clear that the university policy was you can't use it for that. And if a university adopts that as its policy statement, then it's not legal within the institution to use IRA for those purposes. So I say it can't be used as the basis to launch an investigation against someone or a disciplinary proceeding. If that's the university's policy, well, now IRA's opponents will say, but they'll still use it that way. Nonsense. If the university's official regulation is you can't do that with IRA, then they're not going to do it with IRA. I may have missed, I may have missed a fear that I didn't account for, but if I did, I'll revise the statement, because I really don't think there's anything much to be afraid of. In fact, the IRA's been around for a while now, and I would say, if anything, it's been underused. Far from proving this destructive force, too many campuses adopt it and then forget about it. So far from constraining speech, I think it's not had as much impact as it should have. I still think it's really useful educationally. There's such a blizzard of anti-Semitic assertions and claims out there that a student or most ordinary faculty members confronting the world of social media and the blizzard of anti-Semitic accusations and misrepresentations and misinformation and falsifications of history, you can't sort it all out without some categories to put it into. You can't make sense of that phenomenon in all of its wild diversity without having a structure to put it in. And IRA gives you the beginning of that structure. It needs further differentiation, but it gives you the starting point that's really helpful. And I just don't, we haven't seen the damage that it was supposed to do. Now, in 2016 and 2017, there were a few examples of university administrators overreaching and doing things with IRA that they shouldn't have done, particularly in Britain. There were several examples of that. And at the time, a lot of people said, there we go. That's just what we warned you about. IRA was going to do this, IRA was going to do that, and now you see it. What actually happened was people learned their lesson. You don't do that. By those a few examples of overreaching, there was a general educational process that those were things IRA shouldn't be used for, and they haven't happened again. The record's been pretty clean since 2016 to 17, and that's one of the reasons I continue to think it's a great device.
Cool. So, Cary, we have a few more questions. We have Stephen and then Charlie. And please put up your hands if anybody wants to ask a question or comment afterwards.
Steve Gurazov here. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm a retired professor of radiology from Tufts. I've been through the academic world through Harvard, Tufts, and BU. But I'm talking about where I went to college, Hobart, in 1964. They had a problem with a hate monger professor who, after retirement, was using the credentials of Hobart and its insignia. The college sued him to force him to stop using that in his lectures because it gave gravitas to his situation. Currently, there is a similar professor at Columbia who I'm working on an expose of his recent book, 100 Years War Against Palestine. To quote a recent book by Richard Landis, it would be considered astoundingly stupid if it wasn't astoundingly false. For example, in his talking about partition, he only mentions it like 200 pages later, saying, albeit never implemented. So I'm working on a student's guide to sort of deconstruct that and give the truth for it. A combination of those might be used by any university to rein in, even though it's already tenured professors.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a question that I actually haven't considered before, and I actually don't have a good answer for it, at least not off the cuff, which is what to do with an emeritus faculty member who implicates the university in his or her public hate speech, because you've lost all the logical sanction mechanisms at that point. I'm not sure there's anything short of legal action that might be available for an emeritus faculty member. That's a real challenge. It used to be when the AEUP first laid out its principles in 1915, they specified that anytime a faculty member speaks, they should make it clear they're not speaking on behalf of the university, they're not speaking as a university faculty member. Over time, that demand dwindled because it became a general assumption that you weren't speaking on behalf of the faculty member. That the faculty member wasn't speaking on behalf of the institution. That became an operating assumption rather than a kind of necessary statement. However, you might, and I think generally it is an assumption. Faculty member gets up and says something stupid in a public space, you don't assume that he or she's speaking for the university. Faculty member tweets, you don't assume they're speaking for the university. But you might be able to use legal action to get a faculty member, an emeritus faculty member, to include a disclaimer like that in his or her public statements. I'm not speaking for the institution. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. That there might be a route one could go like that, I think, to exercise some control over an emeritus faculty member. But you aren't giving any annual salary increases. If a university is still giving an emeritus faculty member privileges, research support, some universities give emeritus faculty members continuing research support, then there would be some sanctions available. But if there's no more ongoing relationship, you lose the power of sanction.
Well, that becomes a state-by-state issue. It's not federal, and the university would have to want to go that route. But clearly, when someone speaks like, I'm a full professor at yada, yada, yada university, and uses that as the imprimatur of what he is propounding, all of these people who from Rutgers University or George Washington, where it's well known, this is where they come from, and they create the aura that they are speaking from someone who has risen to that level and uses that indirectly as part of who they are, what they do, and that the university sanctions it, or the university press of whatever university is publishing their work, it really does have that impact. Now, there may not be any legal reason to do it, but a university could certainly distance itself. And I think a statement that the university distances itself from the work of, or the writings, the speech of Jasper so-and-so, whatever, that would go a long, long way to raise people's consciousness of the fact that this may be a someone who is propounding hate speech that is not, supported by the university. That's all.
I agree, and I think that university administrators, senior administrators, have a responsibility to distance themselves from some faculty, staff, or student statements. Now, every time an administrator does that, says, this is not the university's position, we decry the statement that person X made, you get a chorus of, that suppresses freedom of speech, that uses administration power in an unacceptable way. And I think that's nonsense.
Of course, it's just freedom of
there's a
understanding
level
or
of-
freedom of listening.
There's a level of moral witness that senior administrators have to be willing to exercise. And that certainly means distancing themselves from faculty or staff or student hate speech.
Thank you, Stephen and Cary. Charlie.
I don't know if I'm going to get hostile or not. I'm deciding whether to get hostile or not. I'm not an academic, but I want to make one point, and that is that without broader standards at a national level for all colleges and universities, the ability of each school to have its own agenda doesn't solve the problem. And I work in the investment business. In the investment business, we now have two organizations, one called Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, and the other called Glass Lewis. And they provide something called a corporate review on every publicly held company on ESG matters, everything from their environmental responsibilities, their sustainability of their business, and their governance of their management and boards of directors. And when they come out with a ranking of those ESG policies, it's not tied to a specific industry or to specific size of a company or what they do for a living. It has to do with whether their corporate responsibilities are being met now. And that has, over the last couple of years, that has a major effect on companies doing really bad things in terms of climate issues, in terms of their hiring practices, in terms of their capital allocation. There's now a norm that goes on in the corporate world. It may not work properly or efficiently as need be, but it's there. You cannot have an academic world without some broader level of oversight across all the universities and colleges where there are certain minimum standards of morality and principles of behavior. If there are not those issues, this conversation can go nowhere, because every school can do its own thing. And in many cases, some of the college presidents themselves have become anti-Semitic. So when a college president is anti-Semitic, how does that solve the problem? Even in the United States, at one point we had a president, he's now in hospice, Jimmy Carter, who wrote a book about Jews being an apartheid people. That legitimized the whole issues of that. So we need to have standards, morality across different venues, whether it's an academic institution or a business institution or any city or state. It requires some form of standards. ISGAP should be providing standards that are the menu of every school in this country to have a minimum moral standards. That's my two, and maybe it's hypothetical, but it's not hypothetical in the business world anymore. The business world requires an ESG analysis. Every publicly held company today, you can get their ESG documents. It's on the internet. That same thing should be occurring in the universities. That's
Well,
my.
I agree with you that national standards are important, especially since for quite a few years, I was seriously occupied in trying to articulate them. I mean, the American Association of University Professors is supposed to provide those national standards, and it does in many areas.
But that's self-policing. That's self-policing.
Well, it's not representing any given campus. It's a national consortium of faculty and some staff that tries to judge how universities should function. And Historically, at least, those policies came from what's called Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. And the membership of Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure wasn't just limited to the academic world. There were, when I was on it for 9 years, when I was on that committee, there were high prestige legal authorities there. There were some university administrators. One of the people high up on the World Bank was on the committee. So there was some corporate representation there as well. And the aim was to set standards for the academy. Unfortunately, it's really gone wrong since 2015 in trying to deal with anti-Semitism. It has made what I think are several fundamental errors, starting with the decision in 2015 that faculty speech on social media should be free of any professional oversight and any professional evaluation, and finally, any professional consequences. I think that was a terrible
That's a
mistake.
disaster. That's a menu for a disaster.
That's the same year. I don't know if the name Rabab Abdul Hadi means anything to you.
Yeah, I know. Who it is.
She's a faculty member at San Francisco State University and one of the most remarkably devoted anti-Zionist faculty members in the country. The AUP gave her their National Academic Freedom Award in 2015, which basically sent a signal in support of anti-Semitism. So I think that the AUP has really gone wrong over the issue of anti-Semitism since 2015, and it's only gotten worse. That's one of the reasons why I'm speaking out against it. I was there during those battles in 2015, and I lost all of them. I was AUP president, but I was outvoted, and it's continued that way since. But the AUP has, historically done a pretty good job in setting those national standards. It's self-regulation by the profession, but not self-regulation, to use your analogy, by any given corporation. It's not government regulation, and I'm opposed to government regulation across those standards. I think it has to be people who understand the institution of the university. But if the institutions of the university are failing, then they're going to confront government regulation and public regulation. That was the sort of fear that I expressed in my talk, that if universities don't do that job themselves, with the example being social media, others are going to do it for them. If they can't exercise some ethical principles, someone's going to fill the role. And they're not likely to fill the role in a very subtle way. But in principle, I agree with you. So if that was your model of how to get hostile, you failed. Try again.
I don't know what my model is. I have a theory. My theory is very simple. Democracies and capital markets are fabulous institutional mechanisms for allowing creativity, wealth creation, but you need to have civility, morality, and some discipline in a society. Without those moral principles, these other mechanisms to create liberties and capital market opportunities, they will be corrupted over time.
Yeah, they become rapacious.
Right.
Thank you.
I've said
Thank you,
enough.
Charlie. Thank you. So on that note, Daniel, the floor is yours. Anybody else, please raise your hands. Daphne, you can lower the hands of people who already asked the questions.
All right, Cary, thank you. In connection with this case study that you focused on Professor Sheehy, can you describe any oppositional response she experienced, whether from the student body or staff or from outside third parties? And I have a theory that whatever opposition she experienced certainly did not rise to the level of inflammatory discourse that you spoke of. And I suspect in some of your losing battles, you also, you come off and present as very staid. And as we sit here today and have a very rational, logical discussion, that's very helpful. But in terms of driving traffic, do we need to meet that kind of discourse in kind? And should we think, as we come up with ways to combat anti-Semitism, should we think in terms of lowering ourselves to that level, and adopting a more inflammatory response?
Well, I mean, I think she's up for tenure this year. I don't know for certain. I'm just counting the years. She became a faculty member in 2017. So this would ordinarily be her 6th year. So there's a lot of national controversy swirling around her case, but her department looks to be strongly behind her, and her university looks to be behind her. I would have to guess she's going to get her tenure, that she will not be sanctioned. I think basically announcing that her Zionist students are suffering from mental illness ought to be a problem in her tenure decision, but I'm not confident it will be. We'll see. Stand With Us has filed a complaint with the Department of Education against GW, using her as their case history. We'll see how that moves forward. We'll see how other organizations act, but she's had pretty good support from groups within the psychology and psychiatry community. So the American Psychological Association is divided into different divisions. Division 39, which is one I've been working with some members of, has elected her its president for this year. So she seems to be getting some pretty good support from her profession.
What about opposition? Who's opposing her?
Well, the Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism is an organization that's opposing her. Daniel Burston, who was on earlier but probably isn't feeling well, was actually online with us. He and I and a couple of other people drafted a letter in opposition to her and circulated that letter amongst professionals in psychology and psychiatry and in other academic fields. And that letter has been out since the 1st and has gathered about 600 signatures. It's a public letter. And we sent it to the Board of Trustees. We sent it to other people. It's still gathering more signatures. So there's a battle ongoing between her supporters and her critics. And we'll see where it's going. I mean, I don't tend to be all that much of an optimist in matters of anti-Semitism. So I'm not predicting success, but at least there's a debate about it at the present time. I mean, as opposed to dropping down to her level, well, look, I have 9,776 of her tweets. I have read through them. I can assure you that was not a one-day process. I spent a good deal of a week reading the damn things. I have a friend who runs an institute doing computational analysis of Twitter and Facebook. So I asked them if they would run it through a system to determine how many of her nearly 10,000 tweets use one or more examples of versions of fuck, fuckwit, so forth, all different variations of the F word. And it came to about 1,500 of her tweets. But that might, there might be a given tweet with 20 of those words in one tweet, right? I'm just saying what are the total number of tweets came to about 1,500 that had one or more examples of that. So that far exceeds my capacity for profanity. She's got me beat on that score definitively. I don't think that profanity will do her any good. I mean, it doesn't look like a faculty member. It looks like a child. It looks like someone who is not fully in control of themselves. I mean, that's, there's a lot of other hostility scattered through all of her social media presence.
Cary, I guess
So far,
my
doesn't seem to be bothering her allies, but we'll see.
I guess my question is more from the prism of trying to combat something like this. How do we go about being more effective? It sounds like we're losing. It sounds like, Cary, you're describing some of your past battles as not being with the kind of outcome that we want. So I'm thinking very practically and in a very applied way. It's shocking to me. It's probably shocking to all of us how you're describing this person. And it should be easy to win this. Maybe we're not doing it right. And so that's why I brought up this idea of, well, maybe we need to be more inflammatory, more effective. I'm not just limiting our strategy to that. That's just something that, I'm bringing up off the cuff, but
we have 3 more minutes left for final comments, but Daniel, your point is well taken. So Cary.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I find that in writing about her, because I've now drafted I think a 15,000 word essay about her work. And although I don't use her language, I am often sardonic and sarcastic about her. And that's already too much for some people who've read the draft, right? I've gone too far, that some feel, in satirizing her practices. So who knows? I mean, I think I'm not sure it's my role to go where you think we ought to go. And I'm not sure what you'd recommend, but it's interesting. I mean, have we had successful strategies? No. You're right, we have not been successful. And I think you're right to challenge us to figure out what on earth we need to do to be more successful than we have been. That's your challenge is thoroughly apt. I don't have a good answer to it, but I think the challenge is extremely important. I think most of us know that anti-Semitism is going to get worse than it is now. And the old adage, it'll get worse before it gets better. Well, over a few thousand years, that hasn't really proven to be, reliable on the terrain of anti-Semitism. So I think we don't have good answers about how to win the battle. We just know that the battle has to be engaged. We know that if we don't engage, it's going to be worse than it is. But, the forces against us are terrible. And the unprincipled people that we combat are innumerable. There are thousands upon thousands of them. So it's a difficult struggle. I think my assumption has been that emulating their tactics wouldn't be successful. But God only knows. I can't tell you that you're wrong in thinking that we maybe should.
So Cary, on that note and that important question, Daniel, thank you. Cary, thank you very much for the presentation and really all the work you've committed yourself and dedicated yourself to do. Your voice and work is really essential in the intellectual and the, political struggle against anti-Semitism. So thank you very much.
Great to get together with all of you. Hope it happens again. Be well, everybody.
You too. So next week we have Naya Lecht, who's a very good scholar out of LA, UCLA, and the Z Club, and she does excellent work on pedagogy and anti-Semitism. So the same time next week, I hope to see everybody. And thank you, and have a good, safe week. Thanks for being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Cary.
Thank you.